important. For me, growing up in the Orthodox movement, I knew that I had to keep my sexual identity a secret. I knew that I could be kicked out of my Orthodox Jewish day school. I knew that I could be disowned from my parents, removed from my synagogue, because that was just the reality of the time. Throughout the 80s and 90s, that was the reality. By the time I was in high school, Canada was bringing up the question of gay marriage. And so it became a bigger conversation in the Orthodox community as like a thought concept here in the States. I remember being in my halacha class, my Jewish law class. I went to an Orthodox girls' high school. I remember saying to my rabbi, Canada is about to vote on whether to allow gay marriage. When will we, as a Jewish community, begin to ask these questions? And my rabbi said to me, obviously I was closeted, he didn't know what he was saying, but he said, Naomi, there are no gay Jews. So, Naomi, there are no gay Jews. This is not an issue within Judaism. Oh, we're not going to have that kind of conversation. And I remember being like, I must have been 16 or 17, and I ran out of class and I went to the bathroom and I cried, though, because I couldn't see for myself how I was going to have a future within Judaism. Like, how could I have a future with God, let alone a congregation or my rabbis, if this was such like a so completely impossible to talk about. I found, though, that there are actually many different ways of being Orthodox, and there are many different kinds of Orthodox communities. So even though I had grown up in like a centrist yeshivish community, when I went to undergrad at the University of Michigan, I was able to be part of an Orthodox community there that was much more open, and I became the president of Ahava, which was the Jewish LGBT organization at Michigan, and also I was an active member of the Orthodox Minyan on campus. And for the longest time in my life, I thought that my personal mission was to bring about change within the Orthodox community and to make the community a more safe and accepting place for queer people like me, and to do it within the bounds of halakha, within the structures of Jewish law. Many things happened in my life, and through a series of positive events, I moved to Israel in, it doesn't matter what year it was because now I can't remember, in 2011. In 2011, I moved to Israel, and I spent 3 years at the Pardes Institute for Jewish Studies, and I got my master's degree in Jewish education. Yes, that's what it's called. Master's in Jewish education. And I ended up becoming a Talmud teacher in a Jewish middle school in the United States. So when I moved back to the States for that job, so interesting. So it was 2014 when I took that first job as a Talmud teacher. And one of the leaders in the Judaic study department, where I was going to be working at a Solomon Schechter day school affiliated with the conservative movement, she called me on the phone and she said, "We are so excited to have you both as like a role model of what it means to be queer and to be involved with Judaism and to be living a Jewish life. But I want you to know this history of our school. I want you to know this history of the Solomon Schechter Day School in Chicago." She said, "Do you know Rabbi B'nai Lappi?" And I'm curious, for those here, do you know Rabbi B'nai Lappi? Okay, so wait, oh, yes, I see a rabbi in the back knows who I'm talking about. Oh, Rabbi B'nai Lappi is, she's the founder of the Sfara Yeshiva, which is a queer yeshiva based out of Chicago. And it has like online learning literally every day of the week. Is a huge project. It's won numerous awards within the Jewish community. She's like a major scholar of Talmud and has done amazing things in order to make Talmud learning accessible. Rabbi B'nai Lappi was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1997, when I would have been like 10 or so years old. And she was closeted when she was ordained at JTS. In 2002, she was closeted when she was ordained, but she came out as a lesbian after she had been ordained. And in 2002, she was offered a teaching position in the Talmud department of Solomon Schechter Day School of Chicago. And when it became known that she was queer, then her position was revoked. Both from the senior rabbi at the school and the board, a number of people had like a major issue in 2002 with her teaching at Schechter. One of the documents that I shared in the drive, and which is shared online, is the letter that Rabbi Lappi wrote back to the Schechter School, talking about what it meant for her to be both a queer teacher of Talmud, a teacher of Talmud who had been offered this job, and a teacher of Talmud who had had her job taken away, who had been fired for being gay, and how she hopes that the Jewish world will someday be able to change, because this is what our children need. Like our generations need to be able to see that you can live a happy, Jewish, fulfilling life as a queer person, and that's not something that you need to hide. When I took essentially B'nai Lappi's job, but like 10 years later, in 2014, the story of her being fired was still an active conversation in the school. And I was the first out Talmud teacher to be hired by the school after her being fired. It took how many years? Like from 2002 until 2014. And so my supervisor felt like it was important for me to know, and it was, because I understood where the community was coming from. But I also felt like the weight and the amazement of being able to play this role now within the conservative movement. So I really made a switch to conservative Judaism once I started teaching at Schechter. And in 2017, I began my rabbinical studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I was ordained as a rabbi. Right before, well, not right before, but while I was living my life and while I was exploring God and Torah and all of these things, there was this internal conversation going on in conservative Judaism that I was not a part of because I was living in the Orthodox community. In 2006, the conservative movement voted on a number of tshuvot, a number of responses. I know that at Bethel, this isn't really like an area of Judaism that we talk about a lot. And I don't, like, how often do you talk? You do some stuff with, so because conservative Judaism is so invested in the halachic system, in Jewish law, there's a system in place of a number of rabbis of all genders who gather together multiple times a year, and they address she'alot, they address questions that are being raised by communities in the conservative movement. And after a question comes up, then they write these long responses according to Jewish law about how to approach the question. Well, some of the questions that have come up lately are about lab-grown meat, about driving electrical cars on Shabbat, about using artificial intelligence. Like, these are the things that are currently being discussed in the conservative movement. And in 2005 and 2006, the main question was, how do we become a more welcoming movement for gay and lesbian Jews? The question of like bisexual and trans Jews was kind of save it for like a later date. And in 2006, there were multiple responses that were voted on, and tshuvot don't need to be perfectly aligned with each other. So many of the responses were actually in direct conflict with each other. So everything from saying that, and I'm summarizing this in a huge way, if you want to read them, you can add your name to that Google Doc over there and you'll get yourself a copy. But everything from like gays and lesbians should not be rabbinical students and should not get married, and we do not want to change, to the Torah is a historical document written by human hands, and we should 100% change this because that's what we believe as the conservative movement. Kind of the middle position that was voted on was written by three rabbis, Dorff, Reisner, and Nevins. Those are all their last names. Rabbi Reisner lives here in the Baltimore area. And this kind of middle position said, the middle position said that because of the strength of dignity, of celebrating human dignity, we should allow for gay and lesbian rabbinical students. We should integrate gays and lesbians into our congregations, and we should figure out how to do gay marriages, but we don't know, like the footnote is like, we're not exactly sure how to do that yet, but we're going to work on it. Though we ask that like people who have penises don't have anal sex with each other. That's like one of the tiny footnotes of the document, and that was what was voted on, and it became kind of this. It became like a key that opened a door, both for a new kind of rabbinical student, but also like it affects all of us, like not only the inner world of like who can be a rabbi and who can't be a rabbi, but it changed the way that like we taught in our Schechter schools, the way that we teach in our Hebrew schools, the way that college campus communities are created, because there's no longer this sense of like shame or like being an outsider for those who are within the queer community. Like that's the power of the movement, that we were able to shift that. And all of that shift has happened within my own life. And for anyone who's a millennial or older, we've seen that shift happen, which means that we've grown up both in the United States and in our specific Jewish movements in communities that were really different and that weren't so friendly to queer people. But thank God, like our children and Gen Z and Gen Alpha, the reality that they've known is that God celebrates who they are and that the Jewish community celebrates who they are. Oh, I'm very proud to be part of that. Oh, I'll end by just going back to my JTS class, my rabbinical school class. And in my Google Drives, I have a picture of my graduating cohort and all of us like looking happy and joyous together, which we are. There's currently a rabbinical shortage, so there's not that many rabbis going through schools. There are 15 people in my graduating class. And Rabbi Berg.
We had a low.
You had a low.
6, but we started with 20, and then a number of people. Some people dropped out. I think at least maybe one in part because of their sexual identity.
Oh, that's so depressing.
Most of them took additional years to get other masters. It just sort of happened that we ended up with that. So we actually were at a time where there were a fair number of rabbinical students.
So the other rabbis at Bethel, Rabbi Dana Sorokin and Rabbi Steve Schwartz, they were students at JTS also in times when their cohorts were like more than 30 people. I think Steve said that he had like 50 people in his cohort.
JTS was always larger than Ziegler.
Like, you don't even have to like everyone if you're in a class with 50 people. My gosh. Anyway, class of 15 students, and seven of us are queer. And 3 out of those 7 are non-binary. So, your future rabbi, or anyone's future rabbi, has like a good 50-ish% chance that they're queer. And with that comes a different sense of, speaking very, very broadly, a different sense of awareness about systems of oppression. And a lot of times, this new generation of rabbis is very, very invested in creating inclusive communities, because our own lives have been shaped by both like a push away and a pull back towards Judaism. So I'll stop my comments. For like when your rabbi puts out her watch, like to time herself. I like where I stopped. And I'll take any questions that people have, and also invite people to grab these Google documents from my drive, and all of like my notes are in them. So there's a lot of like, wow, this is amazing in these long rabbinic documents, and you'll get like a sense of my own thinking. Yes.
Thank you for sharing your story. A personal story and really the story of the evolution. The conservative movement. And I'd like to pick up on where you landed, which is this greater sensitivity to people as they are, inclusivity. And yes.
Oh, that helps so much.
Can you?
Thank
you.
On where you landed about more attention to inclusivity, and maybe more sensitivity to people coming with different experiences. Do you think the conservative movement that there's learning from this process about inclusion of gay and queer people, for the question of patrilineal versus matrilineal descent? Are they related? How do you think the next generation is going to approach this?
Oh, I'm going to answer on a personal level and not on a communal level, because I'll say personally, as an individual, I feel a greater sense of there being a halachic path towards patrilineal descent, intermarriage, and like larger social pictures, like discussing Israel, Palestine, like all of those things are being funneled through my individual experience of feeling excluded within Judaism and then feeling included within Judaism. Even with 50%-ish of new conservative rabbis coming from, let's call it like a largely progressive place, for the most part, there still are very few queer rabbis who are on the CJLS. There are very few queer rabbis that are sitting around that table writing responses and setting the halachic flavor of the conservative movement. There are a few conservative rabbinical students and new rabbis who are hoping to have that impact. In fact, one of my friends, Rabbi Jessica Dallera, served as the student secretary to the CJLS, and she's in the middle of writing their own response about transgender issues in halakha, and will eventually bring it to be voted on. But I don't see the impact of having queer rabbis leading to patrilineal descent in the near future, just because we're largely not involved in like those religious discussions. I think that the impact that we get to have is much larger on the campuses and synagogues and schools and organizations that we personally serve, instead of like movement wide. Because really there's only been just about 10 years of queer rabbinical students.
Can I grab a question off here first?
Yeah.
There are kind of one was, please talk about your spouse, and given that you're queer, who did you get to officiate at your marriage?
Oh. Well,
you can combine those if you'd like.
Yeah. So my spouse and I, we were married at Temple Israel in Boston by a good friend of ours who's a rabbi. My spouse identifies as male and I identify as female, and we didn't have any issue in getting married. And if we had wanted to get married by a conservative rabbi, it wouldn't have been an issue either.
Okay.
Hey.
Hi.
I had two questions. They're very different. One is more of a personal question. Is what drove you to the conservative movement from Orthodoxy? Was it this sense of being queer and that issue, or was it other issues related to, I don't know, whatever it was? And then my second question is, what are the halachic issues for non-binary people, considering the fact that conservative Judaism is egalitarian and at this point has I would say mostly like equivalent of rules for both men and women?
Excellent question. I'm going to answer the second question first, because I think it's easier, and you might have to repeat the first question. The question is, like, if conservative Judaism is egalitarian, then why should it matter if somebody is non-binary or not? A lot of the halachic process around both trans and non-binary inclusion is about the Hebrew that we use in calling people to the Torah, naming ceremonies, conversion ceremonies, wedding ceremonies, like how the ketubah is written. And so because Hebrew has for many years been seen as a gendered language, so we have male language and female language, and only really also in like the last 10 years, the non-binary Hebrew project has really taken off. And so most of these projects, like what my friend Rabbi Dallera is working on, is figuring out what kind of language to use for these different life cycle events in the Hebrew, so that it is inclusive to everyone's experience. Check on that. The second question was...
just add a footnote to that. So just something you might notice here at Beth is in recent years, we made a switch in our practice that some of you who are more knowledgeable about Hebrew might have noticed, and that when we call people up to the Torah, instead of doing so, if somebody wants to be called Ya'amod or Ta'amod, we honor them, of course, but in general, our default now is to say Na La'amod. So instead of starting with a gendered pronoun or a gendered verb, we start sort of generally in an inclusive way, Na La'amod, and then we can call up somebody whatever their Hebrew name, however they identify, and we'll say instead of Rishon or Rishona, right, calling up the first male person to the Torah or the first female person to the Torah for the first Aliyah, we'll say Le Aliyah Rishona, for the first Aliyah, right, the first Aliyah. So that's like one subtle but important change that we made here at Beth, so that when folks come up who are non-binary, they can just give their name and they don't have to like contort themselves to do the other way. Okay, sorry, go to your second question.
Second question was,
Switch
how did you
from
come from Orthodox to conservative?
yeah, switch from Orthodoxy to conservative Judaism. Look, there are a lot of times in life where the slippery slope fallacy is not true, but I became the gabbai of a partnership minyan while I was living in Jerusalem. A partnership minyan is kind of like a type of Orthodox minyan where you need 10 women and 10 men in order to hold services. And women can lead certain parts of services and men must lead other parts of services, depending on what is seen as being whether like a woman's mitzvah can fulfill a man's mitzvah obligation. So I was in charge of one of these minyans for a year and a half. And through that process, it was a slippery slope to realizing that I wanted to be included in all the aspects of services. And that in fact, if we had 18 people in the room and 8 of them were men and 10 of them were women, then I saw that there was a minyan, even though the structure of partnership minyan did not see there as being a minyan. At the same time that I was a gabbai for that partnership minyan and entering into a slippery slope of going from Orthodox to conservative, I was also getting my master's degree in Jewish education, and I was reading a lot of Jewish theology. That, like the way that we talk about God and the way that we talk about mitzvot, even though I did like 12 years in an Orthodox day school, I had never really delved into Jewish thinking in that same way. And I found that through my master's degree that every time I encountered anytime I encountered a non-Orthodox thinker, I was like, oh, wow, like that is how I think about Torah and mitzvot and God. And when I was encountering Orthodox thinkers, I was like, I don't think no. But within Orthodoxy, there's such like a strong sense of social orthodoxy. Like you're really part of like a very tight community. And it's insular in a different way than conservative or reform or reconstructionist Judaism. So it took me like a while to figure out that I was more personally aligned with conservative Judaism. I was more religiously aligned. I was more socially aligned. And I had to be willing to like give up a certain way that I had grown up in order to like make that switch. So I came to it eventually.
Can I grab one off of
Yeah, I
here?
think I'll let you and Rabbi Zaslow call on people and I'll bring the mic in.
Oh, sure. Okay. From Barry online. What has been the response to your rabbinate at Bethel? Any angry, negative congregants, or I hope positive outpouring by young people, parents, queer youth? Has there been any organizational systemic change that has occurred within the congregation?
Wow.
That's a pact.
This meeting
And I
is
think-
recorded.
And I know that there are some Bethel members who are online.
Oh, okay.
Well, I'll say when I was interviewing for positions, Bethel was probably the warmest synagogue that I interviewed at, where other synagogues in the conservative movement made it clear that they did not want more people like me to be showing up. due to my rabbinate. And at Bethel, it was framed as a non-issue. And for the most part, it hasn't been an issue. I think since I started at Bethel, I think that there were sporadic like Pride Shabbat events before I started at Bethel, but it became like a more institutionalized thing during my rabbinate, and I'm very proud of that. Not to get political. Not to get political, but after the most recent United States election, after the latest election, I had a number of parents from the Hebrew school who have children that are queer, non-binary, or trans, reaching out to me with a new type of intensity. And I felt like a more personal drive within this work, that there's a real value to having a rabbi who has a specific lived experience that the children can see and that the parents also feel supported by. So even though we do not have like a huge queer community at Bethel, but that there's been an important shift, especially within the families, of how they're relating to the synagogue. So I'm pleased and like very delighted to be in that role.
Great.
I can actually add to that a little,
Because you were at
I don't
Bethel.
have
Will
the
you
political, I can tell you just
take them?
from knowing people at Bethel, that between your being hired and your writing, there was a tiny little bit of pushback, less than they expected. But I can tell you that both the senior staff and the lay leadership, it meant nothing to them at all. So it was a non-issue. So there was a little bit, like I said, they were prepared. It was very small, and it was inconsequential, both to the process and who they felt they were getting this amazing rabbi, and inconsequential to staff and lay leadership. So.
And I've had congregants, especially in the second and third year, say over kiddish, like, "Oh, Rabbi, I didn't think I would like you, but you're doing great. You're doing great." And so I like what they're talking about is like I think that what they're alluding to is like this aspect, and you know. Yes, like I am part of like this switch of conservative Judaism, and I'm glad that it to kind of lay that pathway forward. Maybe one or two more questions.
We have, it's 8:45. We have, I mean, if you're okay, we have still 15 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, there
Oh,
we
yeah,
go.
yeah.
It's-
I'll let you.
Yeah, you can pick or
Who
whatever.
who's
Sorry.
Okay, so yes,
So,
1983.
yeah, so you telegraphed where I'm born, when I was born. So it sounds like we're around the same age. I grew up Reform in a conservative Orthodox day school in Kansas City, which is not a small community. But I wonder about the net effect, and you used an interesting term, slippery slope, which could end up out of the faith at all if someone feels not welcome in especially a smaller community. And with the paucity of rabbinic graduates, just not enough of rabbis to staff. And I'll name a place like Cumberland, which is now adding population. Among them, I know are some Jews. Some of those families had come to Baltimore in previous generations. Are you aware of any net effect on like smaller communities, and if it's easier to do and recalibrate what you've done in a place like Chicago or Baltimore, and the interplay, if you went Orthodox to conservative, did you notice folks going conservative to Reform or other?
So that second part, like if I've noticed people going from conservative to the Reform movement, like as if the movements are in some kind of slippery slope.
Oh, can you repeat the question a little bit? Someone couldn't hear it.
The question is like, what have I noticed in the conservative movement? If people have felt pushed away, have I noticed people leaving the movement? And in truth, like my involvement with conservative Judaism has only been like I started working in a conservative day school in 2014, and in 2006 the movement had made the decision to bring in gay and lesbian rabbis, and like this, the reality has just been different. So I personally don't know anyone who's moved out of the conservative movement because of, actually that's not true. Rabbi Dredge in bum, bum, bum. Actually, I can think of a few Hebrew college students who grew up in the conservative movement and left, like, who are our age. Yeah. So I know rabbis where that's been a reality.
I guess that's more the question. Yeah.
Yeah.
We also see lots of, we see that there's some great people who grew up in the reform movement who have become conservative. So,
And also like with like the denominations are only as useful in the ways that they help us get closer to God and to live a life of Kedusha. And with rabbinical programs like Hebrew College, and we're seeing like we're all invested in a future where Torah learning and access to God are accessible to Jews, no matter what denomination they end up with. And the other question was about smaller Jewish communities.
Especially if in the scenario very real where it's a smaller aging community and there's not enough critical mass to accept the rabbi that they can get, so to speak, what might happen?
This is being recorded.
It still is, yes.
I actually think that this is one of the major problems within conservative Judaism today, from an internal, behind the curtain kind of view, not like in talks with like the system within conservative Judaism that helps rabbis find jobs. The reality is that a number of smaller congregations will not get a rabbi because the rabbi that they want is not the rabbi that is available. So if right now there are like 40 jobs available through the Rabbinical Assembly, the movement of conservative Judaism, first of all, people who are queer aren't going to go to certain states where their rights aren't going to be protected. So that takes out like 3/4 of the jobs that are currently available. And then, like, you're asking yourself, do I want to move my family into a community where we're going to be the only queer family? And then the synagogue is asking themselves, like, who is this rabbi that we're imagining to have? Yeah, it's very hard in that way. And right now, the Jewish Theological Seminary is doing what it can to prepare congregations for who the rabbis actually are. So there's a new push this year to send rabbinical students to multiple congregations so that congregants can see who these current rabbis are, and so they can mentally prepare themselves for the fact that their new rabbi is not who they originally pictured in their head. And if they're going to want a rabbi in 5 years or in 6 years, what kind of structures do they want to put in place in their community to make that an appealing choice for someone who's LGBTQ? Over here in the gray, and then up here in the blue.
If there are 40 jobs open and 15 graduates of JTS, does that mean that they're like, not only are you're not going to get a rabbi that you imagine, but you're just not going to get a rabbi?
Yes. Yes.
And there is another rabbinical school in the conservative movement as well.
There is another that offers better financial aid, so we can plug.
Look, it's true, and that there's a low number, and also rabbis just coming out of rabbinical school typically go to congregations of a certain size. but you wouldn't have, the senior rabbi of Bethel, right, wouldn't be somebody right out of rabbinical school. So there's also like a kind of scaffolding of, experience plus training that's factored into this.
But you can be fresh out of rabbinical school and you can be the rabbi of like a micro congregation, like a congregation with 100 or 150 families, like.
Micro.
Okay, just Bethel has over 1,500 families, so it's
Jeez.
not
You're the
micro.
weird ones.
Hello.
That was perfectly reasonably small.
How many families was
125.
125. Yes.
Last question. Get the last one.
Yeah, so this last question is gonna mix data and an anecdote, so if it may not be true entirely.
Okay.
There is a fear because of the Pew Forum that Jews have a much more accelerated move outside of their religious communities compared to other religious traditions, becoming the religious nuns. And so that's what I've read. I guess that's the data point. The experiential point is that I work with rabbinical students, seminarians, Muslim, Christian, in a variety of contexts. And the 50% number that you're describing seems much higher in Reform and Reconstructionist Judaism, to the point where when we lead some retreats, all the Reconstructionist students are LGBT2 identifying or at least affirming. And it seems that the relationship with other clergy connects to this Pew Forum issue, because if people are moving out of synagogues, that is becoming religious nuns, but liberal Jewish movements have become more inclusive. Do you think that in 20 or 30 years, when the people who are on the margins of these halachic decisions become the gatekeepers of it, that we might see a move back into Jewish contexts institutionally in an environment that's become more hyper-authoritarian, hyper-xenophobic, hyper-homophobic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic?
So,
Do you see a positive future when the 50% becomes 60% or 70%? That this actually could be the future of Judaism in the U.S.
I mean,
Is that too convoluted?
yeah, I mean, I can't predict the future, but within not being able to predict the future, then I do predict that this is the future, that Judaism's strength is in a personal connection to God, and I believe in a personal connection to Torah. And that means, though, that communal spaces don't need to be people's end-all, be-all of being Jewish. And guides are always needed in order to help make Judaism accessible to people. So, like, we're living in a time where most millennials and Gen Z and even Gen X are not invested in religion in communal religion the same way that their, like, let's say grandparents were. But that doesn't mean that they're not interested in spiritual life. So I think we're just living through a change in what spiritual life looks like. And I'm not sure what the future of the CJLS, the Committee for Jewish Laws and Standards, will end up looking like. That I really don't know, because that's not like an area of my rabbinate that I'm invested in.
Well,
Cool.
please join me in
Thank
saying
you.
thank you.